car that launched a billion-dollar franchise. A 1970 Dodge Charger so iconic, it didn't need a name. Everyone just called it Dom's car. It crossed the quarter mile. It jumped a moving train. It got resurrected from a junkyard and turned into a legend. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling on that first film in 2001, the real story began. And almost nobody knows it. Not the whole thing. Not the part that should make every gearhead genuinely furious. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, where we dig past the credits, past the press releases, and past the fan forums to find out what actually happened to the cars that define the films you grew up with. Why this car matters. Before we talk about what happened to Dom's Charger after filming, we need to talk about why this car carried the weight it did before the cameras ever rolled. Because the 1970 Dodge Charger did not arrive on a Universal Pictures set in 2001 as a blank canvas, it arrived with 20 years of cinematic mythology already attached to it. The muscle car era, the late 1960s through the early 1970s, produced a generation of American automobiles that were essentially aggression made physical. Broad shoulders, long hood, a stance that communicated intent before the engine was even running. The Charger was among the most extreme expressions of that era. It was the car Chrysler built when they decided that winning on the NASCAR circuit and winning in the showroom were the same project. The result was a fastback so aerodynamically deliberate, so architecturally purposeful that it looked fast standing still. Hollywood understood that immediately. Bullitt in 1968 put the Mustang on the map and the Charger in its rearview mirror, but even losing that chase, the Charger looked dangerous. Vanishing Point in 1971 used the open American highway as a meditation on freedom and the Dodge Challenger as its instrument, but the Charger hovered at the edges of that whole era's identity. By the time the muscle car era started dying under the weight of federal emissions regulations and the 1973 oil crisis, the Charger had already become shorthand for something. Raw American mechanical confidence. The idea that you could build a car so fast and so mean that the world had to get out of the way. That was the inheritance that Dom Toretto's garage received. Director Rob Cohen and writer Gary Scott Thompson understood the lineage when they put a Charger in that garage. They weren't just choosing a cool car. They were connecting their street racing story to every muscle car film that came before it and saying, this is where all of it leads. This is the car that sits at the center of this world. The build, what Dom's Charger actually was. Now, let's talk about the actual machine. And this is where I need to correct something, because the internet has been operating with some fuzzy information on this for years. The production of the Fast and the Furious required multiple Chargers to be built. This is standard Hollywood practice, and we've covered it before on this channel. You build a hero car for the close-up work, for the interior shots, for anything that requires the camera to actually live inside the scene with the vehicle. And you build stunt cars, more expendable versions built to the same exterior specification, but configured specifically for the sequences that will destroy them. The Charger from the first film was no different. For the production, the team sourced several 1969 and 1970 Dodge Chargers. And here I want to be precise because this distinction matters. The car most prominently featured in the film, the one sitting in Dom's garage, the one that races at the end, is presented on screen as a 1970 Charger. That's the character's car. The specific model year matters because the 1970 Charger was the last of the second-generation body design, the cleaner, more aggressive refinement of what Chrysler had started in 1968. Slightly different grille, slightly different trim, same basic architecture, but enthusiasts know the difference. The hero car was built by Craig Lieberman, who served as the technical automotive consultant on the film. Lieberman has been remarkably forthcoming over the years about what the production actually had, and his accounts are about as close to primary source documentation as you're going to find on this. He has stated publicly that the Charger used for the primary close-up and garage scenes was not, in fact, a fully built-out performance machine the way some accounts have suggested. The car's engine bay was relatively modest under the hood for filming purposes. The visual presentation was everything. The wide body stance, the hood scoop, the menacing silhouette. What was under the hood mattered less than what it looked like from the outside, because the camera was never going to ask it to actually run a quarter mile in 9 seconds. The stunt cars were a different matter. Those were built with actual performance in mind because stunt cars have to move. The engines varied across the multiple cars in the production fleet, and the specifications changed depending on what each car was going to be asked to do on any given day. Supercharged builds for the high-speed work. More modest setups for scenes where the car needed to move convincingly, but not dangerously. This is the reality of how movie cars are built, and the Charger fleet was no exception. The paint was a deep matte black with subtle pearl, a color that shifts depending on the lighting and has driven restorers half crazy trying to replicate it exactly. Sound familiar? It should. Eddie Paul had the same problem with the Cobra Mercury a decade and a half earlier. Apparently, Hollywood has a thing for paint that behaves differently every time you look at it. The final count of Chargers involved in the production is disputed, but multiple sources, including Lieberman's own accounts, suggest somewhere between 3 and 5 cars were used across principal photography. More on what happened to all of them in a moment. On-set life. The cars during filming. Here's the thing about Dom's Charger that separates it from most movie hero cars. It doesn't just appear in the film, it has a mythology within the film. The garage reveal scene, Dom pulling that tarp back and the car sitting there in the dark, is one of the great movie car introduction moments of its generation. Cohen shot it like a religious artifact being uncovered, slow, deliberate, the car earning every second of the audience's attention before it ever moves. And then, it moves. The quarter-mile scene at the end of the film is everything the previous 90 minutes was building toward. Brian O'Connor in a Supra. He built himself. Dom Toretto in a Charger that's been in his family since before either of them could drive. Two different philosophies of speed. Japanese import, precision, versus American muscle violence. Going head-to-head on a straightaway with a freight train as the finish line. The Charger gets hit. The Charger rolls. And somehow, Dom walks out of it. Filming that sequence was not simple. The production used multiple cars across those shots, rotating between the hero car and the stunt doubles, depending on what was required for each setup. The rollover sequence was performed by a dedicated stunt car built specifically for that impact. The close-up of Dom behind the wheel, the interior shots, the garage scenes, that was the hero car. The train impact itself, that was a car that was not coming back from it. Craig Lieberman has recounted that working on the Charger build was genuinely exciting, precisely because of the weight of the car's history. You're not just building a prop, you're building a cultural statement when that tarp comes off and the audience reacts the way they did in 2001. And they did react, trust me. That's not just good cinematography. That's the car doing its job. A well-chosen movie car tells you who the character is before a word is spoken. Dom's Charger told you everything. Stuff after the cameras stopped, where the cars went. And now here's where the story takes the turn that anyone who's been watching this channel for a while is already dreading. Because this is where Hollywood does what Hollywood does. When production wrapped on The Fast and the Furious in 2001, the surviving cars from the Charger fleet entered the post-production pipeline. And what happened next depends entirely on which car you're talking about. The stunt cars that were damaged or destroyed during filming were gone. That's the nature of stunt cars. They're built to be used up, and the train rollover car was no exception. Nobody expected those to survive. The question was always about the hero car and the surviving stunt doubles. And here is where the story splits into two very different trajectories. Universal Pictures, to their credit, did not simply sell everything to a junkyard the way Warner Brothers sold the Cobra Mercuries after Cobra wrapped in 1986. Universal was already beginning to understand, even in 2001, that they had something on their hands with the franchise that might justify a different kind of stewardship. The Fast and the Furious was not expected to become what it became. No one in that production office was sitting around in 2001 saying, "Better preserve these cars carefully because we're going to be making sequels until 2025. But they weren't entirely careless either. The primary hero car, the one used for the garage scenes, the close-ups, the principal photography work, was retained by Universal. It went into the studio's possession, and for a period following the film's release, an enormous success. It appeared at Universal Studios Hollywood as part of a promotional display. This is actually better than most movie cars get. A lot of vehicles that were genuinely used in iconic films simply disappeared into fleet returns and private sales within weeks of production closing. The Charger at least got acknowledged, but a display at a theme park is not preservation. It's promotion. And when the promotion cycle ends, the question of what happens to the car becomes a different kind of question. One that Universal answered in stages across the following years as the franchise grew, and the studio's relationship with its own automotive history became increasingly complicated. The hero car's journey. Here is what the documented record shows, and I want to be careful here because this is an area where fan mythology and verified fact have become genuinely tangled over the years. Following its stint in promotional use at Universal Studios Hollywood, the Hero Charger, or at minimum, the car being presented as the Hero Charger, and we'll come back to why that distinction matters, entered a phase of institutional custody within Universal. The franchise's growth through 2003's Too Fast 2. Furious and Beyond meant that the original film's cars were acquiring significant cultural and commercial value. Universal was not unaware of this. The car made appearances at fan events. It was transported, displayed, photographed with cast members at promotional moments. This is actually the good part of the story, the part where the studio behaved like an institution that understood what it had. Compare that to the lightning trucks from the first Fast and Furious film, Ford loan vehicles that went back into the fleet pipeline with no documentation and nearly ended up parted out 2 decades later. The Charger did not suffer that particular fate. Universal held on to it. What becomes murkier is the question of exactly which car was displayed at which event across the nearly quarter century that's followed the original film's release. Here is the reality of multi-car productions. When you build several versions of the same vehicle to identical exterior specifications, and then the franchise expands and the cars travel and years pass, the chain of documentation that confirms this specific chassis is the specific car from this specific scene becomes extraordinarily difficult to maintain with total confidence. Craig Lieberman himself has addressed this over the years, noting that provenance on the Fast and Furious cars is complicated precisely because so many versions were built, and because the studio's handling of the fleet was not always as rigorous from a documentation standpoint as it should have been. What can be said with confidence? At least one Charger from the original production remained in Universal's custody and was treated as the representative hero car of the franchise. It appeared at the Fast Saga's final theatrical celebration events. It has been part of the franchise's official promotional history. It is not sitting in a junkyard, it is not missing. But whether it is definitively, chassis number verified, the exact car that sat under that tarp in Dom's garage, that question has a more complicated answer than most fans realize. The myth versus the reality. Let's address the biggest piece of fan mythology that circulates around this car, because it comes up in comment sections constantly, and it deserves a direct answer. Vin Diesel did not keep the Charger. He was never offered it. It was not his to keep. This is the most persistent misunderstanding in Fast and Furious automotive history, and it's understandable where it comes from. Dom Toretto and Vin Diesel became so thoroughly identified with each other, and the Charger became so thoroughly identified with Dom, that the logical fan assumption was that the actor must have some personal connection to the physical car. Add in the fact that Diesel is genuinely a car enthusiast. This is not a case of an actor performing interest he doesn't have, and the myth writes itself. But movie cars belong to studios. Full stop. Paul Walker didn't own the Supra. Steve McQueen didn't own the Bullitt Mustang, though he tried to buy it, and the family eventually found it in a barn half a century later, which is a whole other video. The cars are production assets. They're built on production budgets, they're insured by production insurance, and when filming wraps, they belong to whoever financed the production. In Universal's case, that meant Universal. Now, Vin Diesel does own Chargers. He has owned several. He is legitimately attached to the car as an automobile, separate from the film. But the specific cars built for the production of The Fast and the Furious were never his personal property. And the idea that he has one sitting in a private garage somewhere in Los Angeles waiting to be revealed is a fantasy, not a fact. The other myth worth addressing is the idea that the car's specifications as seen in the film represent a real, drivable, 9-second quarter-mile machine. I touched on this in the build section, but it's worth being direct. The hero car was built for visual impact, not performance. The car that wins that race on screen is a movie car delivering a movie moment. The closest thing to a real-world version of what Dom's Charger is described as in the film would be a purpose-built drag car that shares almost nothing with the hero vehicle except the body shape. That's not a criticism. That's just the reality of how films work. The fate of the stunt cars. While Universal retained at least one Charger from the production in an official capacity, the stunt cars tell a different and more typical story. The car destroyed in the train impact sequence is confirmed gone. Stunt cars built for that kind of sequence are not designed to survive it. They're engineered for the specific moment, and the moment consumes them. There's nothing left worth recovering. That car did exactly what it was built to do, and it's done. The surviving stunt doubles, the cars that went through production without being destroyed, had more varied fates. Some were reportedly sold through the production's normal vehicle disposal process. A small number entered private hands. The challenge with these cars, as with the Lightning trucks that Craig Lieberman's own research and the work of Furious Garage eventually illuminated, is that stunt cars built to hero exterior specifications are visually identical to the hero car. Without documentation, without a verifiable chain of custody, without a VIN that traces back to production records, you cannot distinguish a surviving stunt Charger from one of the hundreds of tribute builds that have been created in the decades since the film's release. And here is the brutal truth about Fast and Furious tribute builds. They are extraordinarily well executed. The car culture community that the franchise inspired has been building 1969 and 1970. Chargers to Dom Toretto specifications for over 20 years. Some of those builds are so accurate that they have appeared at events and in publications as alleged production vehicles. This is not malicious. Most of these builders are proud enthusiasts doing extraordinary work. But it means that when a Charger surfaces claiming to be Sora from the production, the documentation has to be ironclad. Paint match and the right wheels are not enough. What it all means. Here's what I want you to take away from this story, and it connects to something we've talked about on this channel before in the context of the Dirty Mary Crazy Larry Charger, sitting in a backyard in Sun Valley and the Fast and Furious Lightning trucks that nearly got parted out. Hollywood has a systematic problem with automotive preservation. It is not unique to any one studio or any one era. It is a structural problem that stems from the fact that movie cars are treated as production assets during filming and as disposal problems after filming. The vehicles that survive, the Bullitt Mustang in a barn, the Cobra Mercury in Virginia, the Training Day Monte Carlo in the community it came from, survive in spite of the system, not because of it. The Fast and the Furious franchise is arguably the most car-centric major studio franchise in the history of cinema. It has generated billions of dollars. It has made ordinary automobiles into cultural icons. It has introduced multiple generations of audiences to car culture in a way no other media property has managed. And its relationship with the actual physical vehicles that made all of that possible has been, at best, inconsistent. Universal did better than some, worse than others. The hero Charger survived. It was not thrown away. But the documentation, the rigorous chain of custody verification, the kind of institutional commitment to provenance that would allow you to stand in front of that car and say with absolute certainty, this is the chassis that sat in Dom Toretto's garage in 2001. That work was not done with the seriousness it deserved. And in a franchise built entirely on the premise that some cars are more than machines, that should sting a little. The people who have done that work are the fans. Researchers like the team at Furious Garage, who traced VINs and dug through production records and physically located vehicles that studios had released back into the wild without a second thought. The car culture community that built thousands of tribute Chargers, not because they were fooling anyone, but because the original inspired them that much. The preservation instinct in the Fast and Furious world lives with the audience, not always with the studio. Dom Toretto says, in a line that became one of the franchise's defining statements, that it doesn't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning. I'd argue that when it comes to automotive history, winning means getting there before the parts truck does. And the fans have been winning that race inch by inch for over 20 years. The 1970 Dodge Charger from the Fast and the Furious is the rare movie car that became bigger than the franchise it launched. And that is saying something, because the franchise it launched is one of the highest grossing in cinema history. It deserved better documentation. It deserved the kind of institutional care that a costume or a prop would have received. What it got instead was a complicated, partially verified, mythology-tangled life that is honestly more interesting than a clean provenance story would have been. If you want to see a verified Fast and Furious production vehicle that has been properly documented and preserved, go find Furious Garage. Their work on the Lightning trucks is exactly the kind of research this franchise's automotive history deserves. Link is in the description. This is American Muscle. I'm Johnny. If this story hit different for you, drop a comment below with what you think Universal should do with Dom's Charger right now. And subscribe, because we've got more of these stories coming, and some of them are even harder to believe than this one. Stay curious, stay loud, and we'll see you in the next lane.